Well, welcome to our audience. So today we'll be talking about employee handbooks, something that as we approach the end of 2019 and we're looking for 2020, many of you perhaps have already begun the process of thinking about what new things you should add to your handbook, perhaps even redoing your handbook. So we'll be discussing a number of those issues, but let me start with some comments that were presented to me recently by a client as I was talking to them about updating their handbook. And one of the things he talked about was that they're now in a planning process, and they're getting ready to update their strategic and business objectives, their organizational and work processes. And so he was thinking about, okay, we need to just do more than this planning part. We need to be able to communicate it to our employees. And so the handbook then became an issue of how do they communicate this important information to their employees in a number of ways, including their handbook. And as we talked about, there's a number of issues then that need to be addressed as we update the handbook. So one of the things he noted was there's increasing competition that requires a greater emphasis on talent management and positive employee relations. So as most employers recognize, the unemployment rate is 3.8, is in that area. And they're having difficulty finding top talent, and so they're looking for any way they can to not only find the top talent, but when they do, to keep the top talent. And so things like employee handbooks can be very useful, very important in maintaining this relationship with their employees. He also notes that his operation is expanding. He's moving into to additional states, new states, and before he had one handbook that was suitable across the country. Of course, over the particularly last 3 years, the federal government has not made any real changes to requirements in the handbook, but states have. Particularly if you're on the East and West Coast. And so now the issue is, okay, how do we address this issue? Do we find out what's acceptable in the state that's perhaps most positive from employee perspective and then adapt that through the country, or do we have multiple employee handbooks? And so this is a key issue. And something you're going to have to address as you move into new states or expand within states. The third issue he wanted to talk about, and we spent some time actually talking about it, was sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is an issue. His company reportedly hasn't had any sexual harassment claims against them, but he is concerned that just because they haven't had the claims doesn't mean sexual harassment is not occurring. And he wanted to be on the front end of the issue rather than the back end. And so we talked about things they could do, including training, but it all starts with them with a policy. So one of the things that we're doing is updating his policy, making it much broader. And by the way, if anyone's interested in this policy, at the end, I'll give you my email address. You can send me an email, and I'll be happy to send it to you as an example of something perhaps you might use in your handbook, or perhaps some modifications to revising your handbook. And then finally, we ended up talking about the fact that in the process of growing and when hiring new employees, that the employees themselves have been changing. He's hiring more and more millennials. Many of his current employees are retiring or moving on, and that requires new issues. New things that they have to consider in just the employee communications process. Not only new handbook topics, but new ways of actually communicating with millennials as opposed to former employees. So these became a number of issues then that we're going to have to address and look at as we approach the time to update the handbook.